rajenam dene tajin saju darsun yenden luzo jase tuyuku chundra chudan chunyi jendre dalemes jambe yonglai du zeden cheje chenra avesreje dale demo men parapsrane Kadan denju yonglo dowaye lodrö pobbe no waye tsardun so tamge doje shaje rizu dong jenje me to je ponjamba serje lombo davra je be koi shaje je shalang go sha tsaro Sanje namze chudra damje jo korwan jidang sedu songdang shakja duwa kudam la ye la sanje pao den lang sha ca jamyan shana durje jin reze saye nimbo dewa nam prasel nam ge nimbo shamba kundu zon yebe se jen je lang sha ca Xie kala chen rao chen kura je, zai pe tong dur xe lun apo, yarwe tan bakun ne sam zai pe, ka yu rumbo che la sha je wo. Chödrak xue jen ne lo ma ru wara, xie jen zik ne chen pe yi xie je, ro so yi la kun ge pa tra wa, rik pe dur je sha la yung go sha tsal. Laso, tene chen namba so, kangdu yu yu na yang, chö singkin nambe, samba shong chup chodo, tu je parambache, sal tablo nang.
Khenpo Rinpoche begins by asking all of you who are present, wherever the place you dwell may be, as this is a digital event, to begin by generating the body-mind, the mindset which is bent on or set on attaining Buddha, the enlightened state, for the sake of becoming able to benefit all beings without a single exception. This precious mindset, Khenpo Rinpoche explains, is to be one's motivation for or basis for listening to the explanations that are to be given.
Tatringe Chödrak Thaye Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye Tende Tatrin summer course ge den gozu gyore summer course gen te gup konin lo yin ba yö chik tong gup ya gup konin lo la ta ho ka ju ne na thoman gozu gore dene lore shendu dangwa dawa chikre den to zamang chab do chene duncha sum gring la tabu ka julen la zuya chik tang control lin la yang duncha kap kap ni kap ko chik den des chene do na France ko show da dawa chik de sheke dawa chik course to gain devate te yang kam be kutsap jingmerum chang ke kanang che nganzo kadur shu ne den zu devate de chre.
So this course that begins today is the beginning of the yearly summer course organized by Khenpo Rinpoche in France, and the head of Khenpo Rinpoche in France is Jamgön Rinpoche, who was appointed as the representative of the late Karmapa Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö as the representative of the Karmapa himself and the head of his entire organization in Europe. Now, the summer course, the first summer course, was in 1995, and for a couple of years it lasted for 4 weeks. After a few years of a 1-month summer course, a number of the participants requested that the course be shortened to 3 weeks, because those who made this request, the majority of them explained that they just had a 4-week holiday a year, and they wanted to have one of the 4 weeks to or for the purpose of holiday making, going to the seaside or hiking in the mountains, whatever people wanted to do. So in effect of this request, the summer course was shortened a week and has since had the duration every year of 3 weeks. Now, once that change had been made, a bit later on, the Kundroling Center, which is the meditation retreat center associated with Dakpo Kagyeling, requested that Khenpo Rinpoche comes there to teach for a week or 2 yearly, which he did. And since that time, Khenpo Rinpoche has spent each summer for this period approximately a month and a half every year. Primarily, of course, because of the head of Dakpo Kagyeling, Jamgön Rinpoche, who on numerous occasions had asked Khenpo Rinpoche to continue with this program.
Then Tagana Shinge, Tawakayin, Jundin Yukinge, resented the Sola, course Dawo, Lord Riganane, Tingmaniram, Tingmatete, Tindayang Mutune, so Devi.
Also, in addition to this, for a couple of years, quite a few years, Khenpo Rinpoche traveled to Dakpo Kagyeling twice a year. And during these 2 visits, he gave what is known as residents courses for the benefit of those who work at the center and therefore make the activities of Dakpo Kagyeling possible for the general public. Without volunteers who dedicate their time to the volunteer work at hand, there wouldn't be any course at all. Because during a course there has to be accommodation, food, therefore a large kitchen for the visitors and so on and so forth. And the people who are residents of the center during these courses do the work needed to make the courses possible. And therefore they themselves, the residents, have no opportunity to participate in the courses. And so for the sake of giving them an opportunity for study, reflection, and explanations in meditation practice. The so-called residence course started. So throughout not the entire period, not beginning in 95, but for part of this long period, Khenpo Rinpoche has also traveled either twice or once a year to Dakpo Kagylin in order to give courses for those volunteer residents.
Peje guj konine songte logic am ni jengan rot masong ma to
Gupchugoni.
Gozuye guj konine tubimba.
Gonga se masonga.
Masong konine.
Sorry, I misheard Khenpo Rinpoche. The summer course started in 92. I should have remembered that myself, however, I did not. By mistake, I said 95. It should have been 92. Tene?
Tene songte logic am ni tange se wuji tingme de jing ten ten re ni che song sam dum ji tinge do ma to ji ge zan chami ge nge
Summer course.
Summer course the cho de yin.
Now, throughout this entire period, starting with 92 till today, there has just been once, Khenpo Rinpoche thinks, it could have been twice, that the summer course was cancelled for various reasons. Other than that, throughout this period, starting with 92 till today, these courses have been given on a continual basis.
Tene tatendege nenden che goya thiyang yang kam ba ku khuma tene yang rik doje ta khorang ge je Europe show ge zo rawote ta ku ga yu len yin song ne ta kasagan zamnen chabra nang re te yu yin nge ha ko.
Now, the late Karmapa, the 16th Karmapa Rangjung Rikpe Lodrö, announced when he was offered the land where you today find this center, Dakpo Kagylin, His Holiness announced that this would be his main seat in Europe. And Khenpo Rinpoche himself, who spent the major part of his life with His Holiness, have heard him say this many times.
Lakpar tuyang tene tavuka yune la lobjong gi yichi zug gogi yuwa tigel pamsing korem lorem tinto samma te jangri bido jeke koran rang ki shaktar nang we nang tene koran ki shaksing chen tembem zai ja yi chachi jigmerum shadi du nganzol migle ten song te ten yon te tan de chinzo ropa che go do kan nang yon te ta jangri bido ji shadi ne re kanang kine jang rik do jare ti kucham jingmela ke representative drabach nang yong tu ta yathap san yo mare ta ngarang chi khase thutup zupon de khase thutup nge ngone peti ki sha shugi sambe thamsha chi long ne tin chin de bi.
Now the late Karmapa did plan an educational institution at Dakpo Kagylin. And in that context, the late Karmapa wrote a document where he set forth the various topics and so on of the educational program for that institute, and which he sealed with the seal of his office, and then gave this document to the head of Dakpo Kagyiling, his representative in Europe and the head of the European organization, Jamgön Rinpoche. And Jamgön Rinpoche has shown this document to Khenpo Rinpoche, in particular when he asked Khenpo Rinpoche to initiate the summer course program back in '92. And Khenpo Rinpoche, having read it and seen that His Holiness himself has or had sealed the document, he resolved to do whatever he could to realize this project. And so ever since, Khenpo Rinpoche has been holding the yearly summer course in order to assist in terms of making the educational program His Holiness envisioned possible. And his resolve to do so, of course, there will be times when perhaps once or twice a program has to be cancelled according to circumstances, according to illness and the like. But other than that, this resolve to assist, Khenpo Rinpoche has kept up to the best of his ability.
Then Jamgön Rinpoche kanna be tüsötla wonen nganzo ke yubi tambate hajang nya chabuchi tene da dunyam rabu cha yore
Kare trapu shariore?
Penna Jamgön
Amcho kuma so.
Jamgön guj koni no nganzo ke chewe tüsötla
Lo.
ke yubi tambate hajang nya chabuchi.
Yeah.
Pe chobuchi kabre Karmapa ge ta number 3 chinchen re de zonyon de ngozu char re. Tin tende chi kab ka te nang yon de ya ta samna ji ma tan de ge mare tene samne tamja te yangcher ong che ne de le ka de le de.
Now, when Jamgön Rinpoche approached Khenpo Rinpoche and asked him to initiate this program, now known as the yearly summer course, at the time the Karmapa school was affected adversely, as it were. Probably all of you have heard about the Karmapa issue. And you somewhat know that this was an issue which resulted in the weakening of the Karmapa school. It was very unfortunate. Now, this issue had started already at the time when Jamgön Rinpoche asked Khenpo Rinpoche to start doing a summer course at Dakpo Kagyiling on a yearly basis. And because of the unfortunate circumstances for the lineage, Khenpo Rinpoche felt that this is a must in terms of what he should do. There were no doubts in his mind in terms of starting this work. and his hopes in doing so evidently are to restore that which has been damaged, and for the Karmapa school to return to what it was prior to this unfortunate situation.
Tene Taganashi Jamgön Doje Tugi Yebado Masona Kaju Lopso Zola Ji Lobjong Gogueva Te Kuchundune Tugu Gongshi Tagaran Yödevre.
Now, furthermore, Khenpo Rinpoche explains the late Karmapa Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö from a very young age had the intention to make educational programs available to followers of the Karmapa school. In his mind, educating disciples would be of utmost importance in terms of maintaining the tradition.
Penata Kamkajuge Tembati Perane Pese Chiluturap Chilujiktung Tujatang Dunjati Katu Tenzona Yamcha Shira Chinore.
Now, du rab gubjagina la goldsure.
Mare Chiktung.
Det du nyamtsare, det gingola nyam ujemara.
Dingala nyam yo mare. Chiktung Tujat Dunjanamda.
Goldsugya du rab de gubjamare.
Gubjamare.
Ona?
Chiktung Tujasigiloa.
Mare de nyam roya.
Nyam roya te chiktung chugya
Yes.
chiktung chugya tang donja tensuka ne nyamcha shiran royo re. Kana re se na sokpu ma tang yawa ngabe karin tenne sheda palmo che de meba cha song
Re chiktung chugya ne goldsugna rava. Digingön la shuyin Khenpo.
Ding le penna shedrup de hachang jebore.
Re shedrup de da du rab katse gering la jöjö bare. Digingön la.
Digi la penna kamon tusum chemba peje tuirap dambasong na chiktung ninja gimjuk somje na pe dewa chiraba. Dene songde druba jebe shakyon de shivu che yö dewa se. 다시라 생긴데 주위에 뒤서도 마송나 직동 얘기하게 낭 대반에 되네 감부군진 주배구드네 정대 셰베 땜바티 시부지 다르송이에요.
So, in terms of the Karmapa school, the founder is, of course, the first Karmapa, Dusum Khenpa, who lived in the 12 and 1300s. Now, during his life and up to approximately the 1400s, the emphasis was primarily on meditation practice. So one should pay attention to the word primarily. This does not mean that there were no educational programs whatsoever and meditation was the one and only thing in terms of instructions and so on available. Not at all. There were educational perspectives, but these had not gained that much strength yet. At the outset of the Karmapa school, meditation practice was primarily or was the primary perspective of the Karmapa school, as it were. Then in the 1400s, educational programs and institutions became more common and developed to a very great extent. Now, around the 16 and 1700s, because of political change in Tibet, the educational institutions of the Karmapa school were destroyed to a great extent by outside forces in the context of the fifth Dalai Lama aligning himself with the then Mongolian Khan, whose army was used in Tibet for various purposes by the then ruler of Tibet, the political ruler, known as the fifth Dalai Lama. And in this way, or because of these political changes, the majority of the educational institutions that had flourished to a great extent in the Karmapa school were closed down simply by the government at the time, the government of Tibet, who was aided by the military forces of the then Mongolian Khan. And it was the armed forces of the then Mongolian Khan that made it possible for the then government to close down all these institutions. And that period, during that period, the head of the Karmapa school was the 10th Karmapa, Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö.
Dati jene chilu chikdong jeje gnang la tene Karmapa kuntrin chunipa shamar kuntrin jepa tene sud kuntrin jepa tensu karla yang kala khansam ya thari shebe det.
Later on, in the 1800s, due to the efforts of the 12th Karmapa, the 8th Sharmapa, and the 8th Situpa, quite a bit of what had been lost was restored.
Yin yang, tate che duse tong rak chik nang la, tene chik tong je gin juk dewa la, tene shamar kuntin chuwe ke kudu la, tene yang ching yarbu kudu jana ching tu Manchuria tu kabrwa.
Manchuria ki kabrwa.
Re ching yarabwa.
Ching raba.
Ida.
Ching
dynasty kabla yang ya jam ma jab tene yur ule yeve te shamar ge densa tenzo gelupal jur ten yang ul ta hanam shebe de ma son zan me cha
shamar ge densa.
Shamar ge densa kanma be densa tenzo pe nyam chong cha so zan ya pan ma ju
however, towards, or rather at the end of the 1800s, again, political change happened. This was during the time of the 10th Shamarpa. Tene Qing dynasty gi Mami Tzu Triong again, the then government of Tibet, Nidu Suyingo, Lumpe Gyalpo.
Lumpe Gyalpo te Jawar Rinpoche Shivar Sha Tsanne, Gyalsab Kundeling ke Kabre.
Gyalsab
Kundeling.
Kundeling Kongitsen Ergo.
Kongitsen Tele.
Da Kundeling Gompane Ergo. So, now, the Dalai Lama of that period had just passed away, and in between two Dalai Lamas, there is always a regent who takes care of the political affairs of the country till the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, the next Dalai Lama, has been found, enthroned, educated, and so on. At the time, the representative was the Gyaltsab of Kundeling. Gyaltsabs simply mean representative or interim ruler, and Kundeling is the name of the monastery this individual came from. So, the representative or interim political head of the Kundeling monastery. Tempe Gompo.
Yeah.
His given name was Tempe Gompo. Now, at the time, in terms of China and its rule, it was the Qing dynasty that ruled. So this was the Manchurian period in terms of China's history. And the interim ruler, Tempe Gompo, or the interim ruler of the Kundeling monastery, or from the Kundeling monastery, with the help of the Chinese armed forces, in that the Gelug school at the time had very close ties with the royal house known as the Qing dynasty. And with the help of those armed forces, the main seat of the Shamarpas in central Tibet, Yangpachen Monastery, was forcibly converted to a Gelug institution, no longer allowed to act as a Kaja monastery. There were many restrictions imposed upon the Tsurpu monastery as well, the head of the Karmapas, and educational institutions and so on that had been rebuilt were again subjected to closure and forcibly converted to the Gelug school, but with the help of the armed forces of the Qing dynasty at the request of the Gyaltsab of Kundeling. So again, the educational institutions, programs and activities in terms of the Karmapa school were subject to destruction simply by those in charge of the country at the time, the then political head.
Ruler tinju go la minkin bug shashok la tene sutu chujin jong neg zuk beke shebe deten zo nyamcha ma chimbre dilaten tu tada pardu ka yu she jun de net.
However, there was a bit of good luck for the Karmapa school in that in the far eastern part, or in the, well, quite a distance from central Tibet, where the political head resided, quite far east from there, there were many educational institutions and the like that had been initiated by the 8th Situpa, and that had, since that time, the time of the 8th Situpa, flourished. Because of the far distance, one presumes, what happened was that these institutions were not affected by, were not reached by the armed forces of the Qing dynasty. These institutions survived in the east of the country, probably because of the geographical distance.
Oh yeah, then Jamgön Doje, Gondo Chondune, Koran, Gayang Kuyan Mumbo see or La Fakton to young, Gaji short, la Shebe Deja Zumatum, Tamebas Gone, Tepena, Tanda, Jamgön Doje Kanang, Gaji Gamba Mambuchi, la Sheda Shunyote, Besson Shuna, Simon Chomba. La canon du sitet gishera changurum bachar kan
trumpa so man trumpa du sitil gishera
changurum bachar kan ne changu shera talegum bachar kan ne changu shera
talegi
to talegre do tembe taput ta tende chene teji halam shebe de ma son kana kansam ya piyung yo.
Now at the time, as was said earlier, of the late Karmapa, Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye, he, from a very young age, had the intention to restore the educational perspective or the educational institutions of the Karmapa school that unfortunately had been destroyed by primarily heads of the political system in Tibet. Now, with the aid of outside armed forces, the help of armed forces of other countries that were called in for this purpose. Now, therefore, Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye, while still in Tibet, before leaving Tibet for exile in India, instructed the late Surmang Trungpa to start a Chödrak, which he did. It is known as the Dütsi Til Chödrak. Chödrak simply means educational institution, and that is, of course, in terms of higher Buddhist studies. He also instructed the then Treasury Rinpoche to start a Chödrak at his monastery, which now is popularly known as the Tranku Chödrak. In fact, that Chödrak was primarily came to be through the efforts of the then Tralik Rinpoche. And so on. He instructed many Karmapa reincarnates to initiate educational institutions, and so that happened to some extent before Tibet fell into Chinese hands.
Benna tsuwule chatsun bayina yang tabachunga so the burger rineten so yongju lodaji tsuknang pate dinan turn the tawgala den the zutete.
Now at Surbu Monastery, where the 16th Karmapa himself resided. There he initiated educational programs for the monastic body, and in terms of the younger monks, they were taught language, grammar, and the like. One starts with language skills, of course. There has to be quite a high degree of language skill in terms of being able to properly read and learn what one finds throughout the Buddhist scriptures. And some of you may have known the late Toga Rinpoche, who was one of the students of that particular program at Surbu Monastery. Korim Jöpa, säger du?
Korim Jöpa är Lorem Dignama.
Det där kan kalla Jöpa.
Kommer att ta den så lobjong det gegenji le shu gegen material och tant dig Jöpa, tem Jöpa, kam ku gishera så bin rodan nan shin chene. Så det zuye che, xexin gongzhu rinpoche ge yang, xexin Khenpo 아치에 숨게디 죽지는 도와달라.
Lasso.
근데 kanka che
Surpola.
Yeah.
Now, apparently, in central Tibet, in terms of educating the monastic body, after the first downward period when educational institutions and so on were closed down by members of the political house of Tibet, as it were. Thereafter, in a given monastery, there would have been, or there was a bit of education. However, since the educational institutions had been closed down by representatives of the political house of Tibet, a proper schooling wasn't possible with classes and so on. That wasn't allowed, simply. So the tradition emerged where elder monks would, on an individual basis, perhaps to 2 or 3 monks who had interest, teach them privately. So it never became the case that there were no education at all. It still went on, but under difficult circumstances, in that education was simply prohibited by the political house of Tibet at the time. However, in East Tibet, the Kham region, it had been possible. Apparently, the political representatives and leaders in Lhasa, because of the geographical distance, and in those days you could only travel by horse, it was very cumbersome, couldn't uphold the educational prohibition system very well. They didn't have people out there to do it. So in East Tibet, the educational system could still take place with proper classes and so on, because it wasn't possible for the central Tibetan politicians to uphold the educational prohibition, as it were, in the same way as they could in their own area because of the geographical distance. Now, the late Jamgön Kongtrül, a great master of the time, had been able to, because of the instructions of the late Karmapa, to rebuild a proper monastic educational institution for higher Buddhist studies at his monastery in East Tibet. And so at the time, the late Karmapa, this is then prior to him leaving Tibet, asked Jamgön Kongtrül to send a Khenpo to Tsurpu monastery in Tibet, his seat in central Tibet, in order to set up a proper educational system. And a Khenpo by the name Achö was sent to Tsurpu monastery by Jamgön Kongtrül Rinpoche for this purpose.
Dene pena tang manzo chungdu yang ripido jikundon jadu peje thoma jadu lojo sinjere kap thedu ne ripido jik lobjong senge de gore son den nenden to son de at chire.
Now Khenpo Rinpoche himself was about 9 years old when he arrived as a refugee in northern India. His family settled in Sikkim in connection with the late Karmapa's monastery there, the Rumtek monastery. And from the age of 10 years old, Khenpo Rinpoche became a student at the monastery under the guidance of the then Karmapa. And he says from that age of him being just 10 years old, His Holiness would frequently emphasize Buddhist education and the importance of it. Now, the Rumtek monastery in those days was quite a simple institution. There was no wealth at all attached to it. It sort of barely survived. This was, I suppose, in the 60s, it must have been, yeah. And they had no ties to anyone in the West, and the area itself was not a very affluent area, so the monastery survived with very small means. And so the students, Khenpo explains, him being one of them, didn't even have a seat, like a cushion to sit on when they went to class to listen to the Lama or Khenpo who educated them. They simply sat on the ground. There was nothing else. Now, His Holiness, Khenpo Rinpoche explains, it was more or less what Manmao calls a mantra. It was more or less His Holiness mantra in those days in terms of speaking to the students. Education is exceedingly important. Education is exceedingly important. He explained again and again and again to the students.
No, that didn't. Jema, that don't you turn shit or the CGL pep. So pep, you do young, I love you to get the gate, and what is a CGL, so love you cheese song. Then young song they.
Now, in 74, the late Karmapa visited the West for the first time, Europe and North America. Now, and there as well, he told people, Buddhist education, you have to educate yourself in Buddhism. He told all those people, who then came in contact with him. So education was a primary concern as to the late Karmapa. And he continually, whether in the West or in the East, emphasized the importance of it. And from time to time, some Buddhists from the West would travel to India, and whenever anyone like that came to visit Rumtek Monastery, he would instruct them the same. Education is of primary importance. So, as to the late Karmapa, it appears that education, now in this case, in the context of Buddhism, was something that he valued greatly and thought of as something very important for any Buddhist.
Perna America ge show ne chu meji yong yina tene tinsu tetela ta ni dejong da bande zo lobjong che go na tedu jaga le permit rag mare kala khabure America pha song thongba ram je kun song te thongba san roju menane tiriana Khenpo Kongtrül nge ya yo tela lobjong che sho song gre.
Now people would, over the years, travel more to India, and from time to time they came to visit His Holiness at the Rumtek Monastery in Sikkim as well. Now, at the time, Sikkim was an independent kingdom, not yet an Indian state as it is today. And visa regulations were very strict. You could only get a 3-day visa, which you would have applied for at the Indian embassy in your country, and that you would have to pick up in the city of Darjeeling. It would sometimes take 2 months or so before the visa was approved of, and then you could travel to Rumtek Monastery for 3 days only. Therefore, visitors from the West couldn't stay at Rumtek Monastery to study there. So His Holiness kept advising all those people who came, go back to the US, attend the educational programs of Khenpo Rinpoche. Now, if you're not a member of that organization or do not want to be a member of that organization, I have sent Khenpo Kartar to Karmatriyana Buddhist Center. Go there and study with him. So he rather advised the people who came to India to go back home and attend a proper Buddhist educational program there.
Europe ne yongkin so chona ishin de tesong gre nge dabu ke ju ne Khenpo sutham ja so tong sha ye da tesong lo jong chi song gre then gam ge ge na lama gendar mu che sal song song gre lama kal rum che sal gendar mu che sal.
Now, as to Europe and visitors from there, His Holiness would tell them, go home to your own part of the world, and to Europeans he would say, attend the educational programs at Dakpo Kardeling. There are such programs because I have sent Khenpo Tsultrim Gyantso there and instructed him to settle there in order to build up an educational institution. However, if you're the kind of person who is who has no interest whatsoever, or who doesn't have much interest in studies, if your primary focus is that of meditation practice, then you also go to Dakpo Kagyeling, because I have sent Lama Gendin there, and he will instruct you in meditation practice. And there are also the Buddhist centers founded by Khenpo Rinpoche, he would tell people, go there. If you're the type of person who is primarily interested in meditation practice.
Gam yakochi gebona lobjong singet ke chembore tende chan chende mena gam yeye khorang goi gari imbate tongbor lobjong chekore nika za lobjong tu de yore sunkre.
Though he would tell people whether they were interested in education or not, for you to be able to meditate properly, you need to educate yourself. Meditation is not something that just pops up in your mind and then works properly. It cannot be done properly without education. Therefore, you should attend some educational programs, even though your main interest may be that of meditation.
Chesa tende tenne nesu tenso che haku yedu tachi education gi yechi zu yongde tenganso tangning shu gwe da za de tenso re.
So it's because Khenpo Rinpoche knows very well the thoughts and intentions of the Karmapa, the late Karmapa, in this regard. And that's why he has more or less spent his life trying to educate those interested in Buddhism, both studies and meditation.
So yin shi ne sam tang na tang ran so tarba tönyer ke lo ji ye chan zong te sonam de cho sa ye sing ge ha chang ke chen bu de.
Now anyone who desires to attain liberation from the bondage of worldly existences,
sonam de cho sa ge ha chang ke chen bu de.
To do certain things for that to happen. One of the courses of action that one needs to take is a virtuous course of action, one of good deeds, in consequence of which so-called merit is generated, merit which becomes a basis for improving on that path.
제가 sonam ge cho sak se yul la chini dan dembe lama le la ji yo ma de di tu gong kong ye de di gong pa du ye.
One of the actions that generates extensive merit in this regard is the course of action of accomplishing the instructions of a qualified guru.
Ta chini dan dembe lama la nam di wo la yaw kam pa la lama chi yung ma re.
And Khenpo Rinpoche explains, under the skies of our world system, there isn't a guru that in terms of realization and qualifications, as it were, good qualities, supersedes the Karmapa.
Ti yin de charan number so lobjong nong ke so yin na yang
those of you who take part in educational programs set forth by a Karmapa and Khenpo Rinpoche himself, who gives the explanations, and the person who translates the explanations given, and by way of doing what one is doing, whether the translator, the lecturer, and so on and so forth, and those studying with proper intentions, all of those individuals do generate a great deal of so-called merit, which will contribute to making progress on the path to liberation. Now, because of the present pandemic, we're now going on to another topic. If we include this year, the past 3 years, it hasn't been possible for Khenpo Rinpoche to travel to Dakpo Kagyeling and to be physically present with a number of students. That sort of teaching setting is and has been for this period of time impossible because of the pandemic and the way it spreads.
Diabetics, high blood pressure,
Now, Khenpo Rinpoche would have liked to travel to Dakpo Kagyeling. It's a very pleasant area to begin with, and the majority of the people who attend the summer course are people who Khenpo Rinpoche has got to know throughout many years, because the majority of the audience, the members, the majority of the members of that audience are people who come on a continual basis. He would have liked to meet again with all of you. However, he's been advised to stay put, simply because of a number of underlying diseases that he's afflicted by. Diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, and so on. Therefore, or because of those underlying diseases, he's been advised by his physician not to give courses where a large audience is present. He would also have liked to have met with Jamgön Rinpoche again. They are very close, and he's quite sad not to be able to do so, and it's 3 years since he saw him last.
Machine cutting and the church is set to Tibet, Gabuchu.
However, he is happy that there is this other option which we're using now, meaning a digital course.
Lasso tatarin tejagi tene mutune sanyin naningi twene ma shugi.
Yeah. So that's all for today. Tomorrow we will start with the explanations of the actual topic.
Sunam de ye damje zegbani tomne nyebe danam pamje jega nache balam tubai sigbe solen do war dol war show. Bila Tama.